Diego State University and the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum, and the respective director and chair, Lily, who I met at a Phi Lambda Charitable Trust get-together with the San Diego Museum. And I told her about my book, and she was enthusiastic enough to invite me to speak. So I'm very thrilled and honored to present this book to you. Next slide. As Bob mentioned, I did write 3 other books on midlife, marriage, and cosmetic surgery. Those are the 3 big topics in Southern California. And finally, another topic, China, which is, I think, also fairly monumental. Next. So this is a rendering of my concept of the cover of my book. And it shows the different themes and images. My grandfather in the middle, which is my mother's father, my mother on the lower right, 3 maps of England, United States, and China, where this story takes place. This image of a cross in the middle, since this is about the church and Christianity in China, and then finally a warplane on the right top, because China was involved in many, many conflicts during the 50 years of this initial story. Next slide. So I want to give you some background on the book and how it came to be. The title of the book is Red Bishop, not The Red Bishop, because it's more of a descriptive term. There were a number of bishops who were referred to as Red Bishop. So he isn't the Red Bishop, but he is a Red Bishop. So I wanted to start out to write a movie about his story after I learned a little bit about his life, because I thought a movie would be very impactful in educating the Western audience. You can see him here in the middle at his consecration in 1940 with Bishop Chen on the left side of the screen, and Lloyd Craighill, who was consecrated Bishop of Anqing Diocese. My grandfather was the first Chinese bishop who became assistant bishop. Next slide. So these were my motivations of writing the movie. I knew a little bit about my grandfather, who my mother referred to as Red Bishop, or a Red Bishop. I don't think my family is that important in world view, but my grandfather was somewhat of a historical figure, being the presiding bishop of the Anglican Church in China, and he, in fact, the last presiding bishop. I also felt that China was a most interesting and important country in the world, and a lot of people didn't know either about the country or its people, and it had a very interesting unknown history, which some of it will come out in the book. I also felt that there was a lack of Western movies, not cowboy and Indians, but movies for the Western audience about 20th century China. The only one I can really think of that had much impact was The Last Emperor. And yet there is a plethora of Holocaust movies about the Jewish experience in Nazi Germany. Every year there is a handful or dozen of movies made about this period in time. There's also a misconception about Christianity's experience in China, and I wanted to clarify that a bit to people, since even nowadays when I talk about this book and Christianity, they argue that there is no such thing as religion in China. There's no church, there are no Christians. It's an atheist country. And so I wanted to bring light to this issue. And there are numerous parallels in current society, including events, and even this event in Ukraine is very reminiscent of some of China's history. When President Zelensky said he didn't want to leave Ukraine, even though United States and other organizations might have wanted him to leave, that brought up memories of my grandfather, who was also asked or implored to leave by both the nationalist government and missionary organizations to leave China, and he refused to do that. There are, in terms of at least Western American movies, there are not that many meaningful cinematic dramas these days. And this story is really about tragedy, both from within China, China's history, my grandfather, my mother, and how that can beget hope. And then personally, my grandfather's chosen Christian name in Chinese is Danjing, which means see or seek the truth. And he named all of my generation's cousins and siblings with Zhu, meaning ancestor, referring to ancestor. And my name in Chinese is Zhu Wang, which is ancestor's hope. So I felt the personal sort of obligation to him. Next. I ran across this book by Philip Wickery, who is a historian for the Hong Kong diocese, Anglican diocese. And at the top, you can see my grandfather's name, Robin Chen. This was during the 50s when he was the presiding bishop. But at the bottom, you can see the sentence in 1918, T.S. Singh, Shen Zai-shen, son of the first Chinese Anglican cleric, was consecrated assistant bishop, and he was the first Chinese bishop of the Anglican Communion. And my father always talked about Bishop Singh, who was actually his grandfather. So on this one page, I have the history of my family, which essentially comprised two bishops on either side of the family. And I thought, well, this is pretty interesting. Next slide. Here is Bishop Singh at the top middle, next to the gentleman in the Western suit. And this is my father's family. You can see my father on the right leaning against one of his sisters. This was in the mid 1920s. Next. And this is my father a few years ago visiting Bishop Singh's stained glass window in London. Next. And so how did these two bishops produce three doctors living in America? And my father is in the middle, in the front row. He was the president of his St. John's Medical School class, and this is his graduation photo in 1947. Next. And this is my mother, who graduated from Jingling College and went to the University of Pennsylvania. Both St. John's and Jingling College were missionary schools and were perhaps the top one or two universities for men and women in China at that time. Next slide. So this is my mother's class of 1952 in the University of Pennsylvania. You can see her at the bottom right. And I doubt if you'll see this type of medical school photo in the United States ever again. Next. Likewise, my father in the middle, in the right second row, you can see he is the only Chinese in this resident class in Boston. Next. Both of them have passed away. My father just recently passed away in October of last year, my mother in 2010. So this book is dedicated to my family and obviously my parents, and I are all doctors. So this is a story of Christians in China somehow producing American doctors, period. Next. Okay, so where did this story really begin? This is Reverend Morrison, who was a Scottish missionary. He came in the early 1800s, spent over 25 years in China. And during his 2.5 decades in China, he only converted 10 Chinese into Christianity. So a fairly poor batting average. He did translate the Bible into Chinese, so that was one of his accomplishments. Next. And part of the reason was this. China was in the middle of an opium crisis that produced 2 opium wars, period, in this period. Next. And you can see that the opium trade started in the southeast in the port cities and expanded throughout China. Little is known about the fact that besides the British, who are known to be the main importers of opium, the United States was the second largest importer of opium. Next. So what did this produce? This produced an imperialistic domination of China. Next slide. After 2 wars, caused the China to open up port cities to international powers, and they developed international settlements, produced Hong Kong as a colonial city, but also opened up these ports to missionaries who were allowed to evangelize. So again, this is an indication of Western domination of China during the 1800s. Next slide. This obviously produced backlash among the Chinese people, and there were a number of different uprisings against both the imperialist West, but also against Christians. The Christians, through the missionary efforts, were tied to imperialism because they were closely aligned with businesses and often were hired as translators. So even though the Christians were themselves thought of as very positive force, among the Chinese, they were looked at as potentially spies, traitors, invaders. Next. So this all culminated in the Boxer Rebellion. Some of you must have been familiar with the 55 Days at Peking with Charleston Heston, that told about the war between the Western powers and the Chinese, including the Boxers. And this resulted in the defeat of the Chinese imperialist government, who was forced to pay reparations to 8 foreign countries, who then divided up China and produced cities that were oftentimes dominated by Western business, politics, and law. So during this time, because the West essentially won, missionaries came into the country in large numbers. Next. And they actually did quite a lot of good things. They had built schools, hundreds of schools, if not thousands. Next. And this is the St. James High School that my grandfather went to in Wuhu, China, along the Yangtze River. Next. And they also built clinics and hospitals. This is the Wuhu General Hospital, built by Methodists. Next. And the St. James Hospital in Wuhu. Next. So this is a photo of the synod, or gathering of the clerics in the Anglican community in 1912. You can see my grandfather on the right below the mirror, the window, with his round head. And in the front are all the bishops. And you can see all the bishops are either from Canada, United States, England. So they're all non-Chinese. So the story begins around this period of time when my grandfather was going to St. James Mission School in the late 1988 or 9, just before this person, Sun Yat-sen, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, rose to power. And he espoused the Sanminjuyi, which is the 3 principles: nationalism, democracy, and common welfare, which he borrowed from the Western ideology, particularly Abraham Lincoln, in his of the people, for the people, by the people, and of the people principles. So I ended up writing this screenplay, and as you can see, in 2016, quite a while ago. It took me a number of years because I had to do a fair amount of research. And you can see the title is Red Bishop. It's not The Red Bishop. So that's important. And you'll find out why in the book. So as some of you know, screenplays are written fairly like shorthand. You give a few directions of action and some interesting or important dialogue, and then you expect the director and the actors and all the people involved in production to make some sense and drama and interesting story out of that. So that's sort of I wanted to do. I wanted to give them a blueprint, and hopefully someone would take this on and make it a dramatic, epic movie of the vein of Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago, all those big epic films that I grew up with. Next. But I immediately found that there were challenges. I sent the screenplay to a fair number of people in the Hollywood movie crowd that I knew, and this were some of the issues. There was censorship in China, which I would suspect that this screenplay wouldn't pass. In the United States, there was preoccupation with blockbuster entertainment like Marvel Comics and animated film. The religious theme is particularly sensitive. There's recent government crackdown in China on religion and Christians. And even though Chinese investments came in the last few years into China, buying up studios and production houses, they basically went away as the government took more control of these financial investments. It's a difficult story because the protagonist, being my grandfather, was Chinese, and the supporting roles would be mainly Caucasian. So this is a reversal of the typical sort of Hollywood construct. Big budget movies, especially faith-based movies, don't really make a lot of money. And Hollywood's focus is on the large movie audience in China. And so they want to make Chinese movies for Chinese audience, not so much the other way around. There were recent blockbuster busts, including The Great Wall, starring Matt Damon, who was a Caucasian hero in China, which didn't play well. And there are many controversial subplots within the book that would be fairly sensitive. The Cultural Revolution, the Chinese don't really want to talk about that. Persecution of Christians, a lot of brutal conflicts, and especially this unsubstantiated claim of US-German warfare, which I will talk about. I'm not quite sure how that would play in the United States. But especially no gunfights, car chases, or sex scenes. So this is a very difficult movie, I think, to sell. Next. But I was undaunted because I was urged by all the people who read the screenplay that I needed to, had to, or should write a book for various reasons. So I went back and did more research. You can see that these are the lists of sources. I don't know if you can play the video, but there were a lot of memoirs from my mother, from my aunt, newspaper clippings, magazines from the church, books, manuscripts, and even dissertations. So I did a lot of research. Next. And again, this is a video which I'm not sure it can be played, but my mother kept over 400 letters through the years, starting in 1948, from her family, mainly her father and her mother. And I had some of these translated, not all of them. That would be a big task, but a few key letters from before the Cultural Revolution. And she did have letters that from 1948 up until the mid-60s, even 1964, 1965, 1966, which were the years leading up to the Cultural Revolution. And I got a flavor of what the family was thinking about. My grandmother, her mother, was mainly talking about family, who was getting married, who had kids, how everyone was doing. And my grandfather, her father, spoke mainly of the advances that China was making after the communist takeover. And spoke very highly of the government, how much the church had progressed, and implored her to come back to China and serve the people. So this played heavily on her mind, and was mainly the main theme of the sort of last third of the book. Next. I also had many pages of my mother's transcriptions of different stories, magazine articles, and even in the middle of her handwritten summary of certain accountings or articles, which I had to decipher. You can see her handwriting is not really great, sort of typical of a doctor. Next. I went through a lot of newspaper articles in the United States. Here's one from 1930 in Ohio, where my grandfather, you can see in the first seated row, second from the left. He went to Ohio to study social services and ended up in University of Pennsylvania, and where he got a master's in sociology. And there were articles where he had given interviews discussing the condition in China. And during this time in the 1931, actually, there was a huge Yangtze Flood, one of the worst floods in human history, where millions of people died. And this had impacted his hometown of Wuhu. Next. He came back in 1946 and 47, and he was much more well known at that time. And so I was able to find many articles of his travels to the United States, Kentucky, Virginia, even Boston, Philadelphia, and Canada, Texas. And he would be interviewed and give his take on what was happening in China, which was after the World War II. And this was during the period that the communists and the nationalists were essentially at civil war. He was trying to raise funds in the United States and implore US Christians to not abandon China or the church. The church had been decimated during the World War II because of the Japanese occupation. Next slide. So the construct of the book is obviously me at the bottom, writing my story and my view of my family story. It obviously has to encompass my parents, who, as I said, became essentially trapped in the United States after their medical education. And obviously that story revolved around their family story, and especially my mother's father, Bishop Chen. So this story is about the family, but also the church, because obviously my grandfather was very involved in the church, in Christianity. And by looking at the history of the church and what was happening there it became basically a story about China. So all these different layers within the book. I finally wrote the book. This is the first chapter that talks about my grandfather being in the back of a wooden cart being driven via bicycle by his daughter-in-law to a hospital. My grandfather had many medical problems in the last couple of decades of his life with cirrhosis of the liver and all of its sequelae. So around him, the Red Guards are essentially destroying Shanghai, and this is the beginning of the book. Now, one of the metaphors in the book is Shang, which is the minister or bishop in a chess game. Shang, there are two Shangs. One is at the top, black, top of the chessboard, the Chinese chessboard, in the position of the bishop. Shang is an elephant, and then the Shang on the bottom is the red bishop. And these pieces move just like Western chess bishops. They move diagonally, but they only move two intersections at a time. The Chinese chess is played on intersections, not on the actual spaces. So, the significance is that this is a defensive piece. You can see the space in the middle, that blank space, is the river, and it divides these two regions or countries. And the idea is that the Shang stays on their side of the country. It doesn't cross into another country. And that's sort of a metaphor for my grandfather, who basically decided to stay in China and not to escape to the United States. Next. So his story is that he went to missionary school, met my grandmother as a sort of arranged marriage, or through a matchmaker. And he got married in a Christian church. This is in the 1919, I believe, or 1918. And you can see his family on the top middle and the right, but he's missing. And he was missing a lot because he was so involved in the church. The middle picture is in 1930 when he was in the United States studying in Ohio and Pennsylvania. And the picture on the right is when he was in the United States again, as I mentioned, trying to bolster support for the church and gathering funds. My mother on the lower left, and she married my father, who was studying neurosurgery, came to the United States to study neurosurgery. He decided to go into neurosurgery, not because there were neurosurgeons in China that he admired or inspired by, but there essentially only one neurosurgeon in all of China, who was in Beijing. So he went into neurosurgery not because what he saw, but what he didn't see. So these are some of the characters in the book. The Yuan Shikai, who was a warlord, top left. He brokered a deal between the imperialist government and President Dr. Sun Yat-sen, and essentially the empress, the last emperor, gave up his power to the new republic represented by Sun Yat-sen, and Sun Yat-sen gave up his power to Yuan Shikai. So Yuan Shikai became the first president of the Republic of China. He was very smart. He was a general in the largest, most powerful army. So he brokered this deal. On the right is Bishop Daniel Huntington, who was an American, and he was instrumental in consecrating a lot of Chinese clerics and promoted this idea of the three self movement, which I will explain later. On the left is Franz Lund, who is a Swedish missionary, and they came in the late 1800s. And many of them actually died during the Boxer Revolution, which had killed hundreds of missionaries and nearly 30,000 Chinese Christians. The woman on the bottom is Alice Gregg, who is the education leader of the Anglican Church, and she was a close colleague of my grandfather. And then Dr. Harry Taylor, who was an American surgeon from Virginia, and he was a very colorful character in the book, very supportive of the church and my grandfather. Next. So this idea of the three self movement had been around for many years, since the late 1800s in many countries. The idea was that the church, and this was adopted by the church, Christian church in China, this idea of turning the church from a Western-based church into a native church with the three principles of self-propagation, self-support, and self-governance. Next. So this was what was happening in the teens after the Republic was established. In 1920, this character, who you may recognize, Mao Zedong, was organizing the Communist Party, and Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chiang Kai-shek were essentially in power for the nationalists. So these two players had 20 years of conflict and alliances, and the church got caught up in the middle, both in terms of running away from conflict, but also having dilemmas in trying to decide with the ideology of the communists, which Christians identified with to a certain extent because they were champions of the poor and the downtrodden and the workers. But the church had closer ties to Chiang Kai-shek, who was eventually converted Christian. Next. So the 20s and 30s, as I say, was 20 years of conflict. The Chiang Kai-shek was ridding the country of warlords in the early 20s. And then the Japanese came in 1927, and again in the late 30s. And so China was involved in turmoil, conflicts, famine, all sorts of challenges. And that is what my grandfather and his family and the church were living in. A very difficult time, and not for months, but for decades. This is the 1938, the 1937 Danjing Massacre, which is not been studied enough or publicized enough in the Western world for many reasons. But this was a horrific incident that impacted the church in many ways. Next. So after all this turmoil, or within this turmoil, the Japanese had occupied Wuhu. And this is just before Pearl Harbor. My grandfather was consecrated assistant bishop of the Anqing diocese. And this is a photograph during that ceremony. Next. To give you a context of where all this was taking place, so these are some of the cities and towns in the book that were important and where my grandfather and his family either worked in or traveled to. And then next slide, you can see the Japanese in 1940 were mainly in the north and the central coast. And then at the end of the war, were really cutting through the country from north to south, and especially where my grandfather and his family was working in Jiangxi province and Anhui. In the late 1940, this is I think 1946, my mother was chosen as a representative for China to attend the celebration in India of their independence from the British. And here she is with President Nero. So she was at this time fairly well known among certain circles, certainly within the mission schools. She, as said, was her class president. Her father was a bishop in the church and fairly influential. And so there was great hope placed upon her, both, I think, from the country and also particularly from her father. Next. Another figure was President Wu Yifang, who was the president of Jingling. She helped my mother come to the United States, and she was the only female signatory and the first signatory of the UN Charter in San Francisco after World War II. And then the Archbishop of Canterbury, Geoffrey Fisher, was important because he and the Lambeth Conference in 1948, which my grandfather and 8 other bishops from China attended, he essentially, with the delegates, obviously, voted down proposals by the Chinese delegation who wanted to allow women to rise to the position of priesthood. And obviously this at the time was not very popular and even not that popular in the Catholic Church these days. But so that proposal was voted down and essentially signaled to the Chinese leaders, Christian leaders, that they were basically on their own, that their concerns were not really the concerns of the Church of England. So that was in 1948, and the next year, 1948, Shanghai was, quote, liberated by the communists and produced a lot of havoc and people trying to escape. And in the final days, communist sympathizers were executed without trial by nationalists and local police. So this event culminated in the declaration of the establishment of the People's Republic of China by Mao, and really was the crucial event that would change the Christian church. Next. A key figure at this time was Y.T. Wu on the left, who was a very influential secretary of the YMCA. The YMCA was present in China since the 1800s, was quite influential, and he collaborated with Zhou Enlai and 40 other Christian leaders, of which my grandfather was not one of them, but this group of Christians worked with Zhou Enlai to produce what is known as the Christian Manifesto, and essentially condemned past actions of missionaries, condemned bureaucratic capitalism, imperialism, singled out Americans as bad imperialist influence, but also declared allegiance to the Communist Party. So they wanted all the Christians to sign this manifesto. They went to my grandfather 3 times, and he refused 3 times, mainly because he wasn't quite sure about the intentions of the Communist Party, and he wasn't quite sure about how that would impact the church. He also, I think, didn't want the church and Mao and Zhou to be the arbiter of Christianity, which was mainly, obviously, God, Jesus, and the Bible. So that was his dilemma. The other dilemma was caused by the Korean War, where Mao wanted to enlist the help of all Chinese to support their efforts in Korea. As you know, Stalin gave go ahead for Mao to send troops into North Korea. And since my grandfather at that time was the presiding bishop of the House of Bishop, and he essentially represented the Anglicans, he was essentially forced to denounce another bishop, Tzu, who had already left the country. And so it didn't really impact them that much, but Tzu had signed a condemnation of China's invasion in North Korea, and because the Chinese Christians were for peace and against war. But that came back to Beijing and essentially made Tzu sort of a traitor because he didn't support China. And my grandfather, as a leader of the Christian Anglican Communion, was essentially forced to denounce Tzu at a public meeting. Next slide. And this produced a division of the Christians between government sanctioned churches, the Three South Church, and so-called underground churches, people who didn't want to be under the control of the government. So there was a rift within the Chinese Christian community. Now, another interesting episode was this in the north of China, at the border of North Korea. There were strange cases of infectious diseases, which essentially led to the accusation of germ warfare committed by the United States and Japan. And this story was told in an article by, next slide, John Powell, who was the editor of the China Weekly Review. And this story brought him a lot of attention in the United States, but also with the Dean of Canterbury, who was a friend of the Chinese. He had visited China in 1930 during the floods, and knew my grandfather and Y.T. Wu. And they met during his second trip in 1952, when the story of germ warfare came out. And apparently he had heard this story from these Chinese leaders, went to the north of China to investigate, sort of corroborate this story, and brought that back to London, where he harangued against the United States. And this led to his debate in Parliament, trying to censor him and get the Archbishop of Canterbury to excommunicate him. One of the people, the Parliament members who stood up for the Chinese leaders and essentially defended their accusations of germ warfare, was Hastings Russell, who was the 12th Duke of Bedford. And he was a sort of colorful individualist, supported was a Soviet file, supported fascist Nazi, was a very controversial figure, but he was the only one who sort of stood up for the Chinese. Next. So during this time in the United States, McCarthyism was taking hold, and this would impact my mother, as you will later see. and the difficulty here for the Chinese students who are trapped here is that the State Department wanted to not send Chinese students back because they were afraid that they might send secrets back to China. Whereas the Immigration Nationalization Service wanted to deport Chinese students because they were afraid that they would pollute American minds with ideas of communism. Hollington Tong was an ambassador of the Republic of China to the United States. He gave a speech at Washington Cathedral condemning both YTU and my grandfather, calling them godless agents of communism, and for supporting John Powell, who was persecuted for sedition, and he was placed on trial. So that episode is in the book. So you can see that there's a lot of international events going on due to what was happening in China. Next. And this is an FBI file that I received from the Freedom of Information Act, essentially telling about the interrogation or court interview, I should say, of my mother. You can see Grace E. Chen, who was my mother, and they interviewed a number of different friends and associates, including her dean of the medical school. Next slide. You can see Mrs. Perot, who was her benefactor. My mother stayed with her. She was a member of the Hubline family. Some of you might know the Hubline Liquor Company. And they eventually bought out Grey Poupon, A1 brands, and later on Kentucky Fried Chicken. But she was a wealthy philanthropist and supported my mother, and they interviewed her. You can see Bishop Roberts and Bishop Tsu. They were interviewed, and the idea is trying to find out whether or not my mother had communist leanings. Next. So this is in 1956, the last photo of the Anglican bishops, Anglican clergy at their synod in 1956. My grandfather, you really can't see, is in the middle left front row. And on the right, this is the House of Bishop, and he is the fourth from the left in the front. After this 1956 photo, the church basically was converted into the Three South Patriotic Movement Church, which was a government-sanctioned church. So, which is non-denominational. All the different denominations, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Methodists, came under one roof, sanctioned by the government, and the Church of England, Episcopal Church of the United States, and the Anglican community essentially went away. Next. In late 1957, 58, the Great Leap Forward was instituted, and this was totally disastrous, where essentially steel became the new opium of the masses, and everyone was trying to melt down steel because the Chinese government wanted China to surpass Britain in steel production within 5 years. So everybody was melting different metal objects in these homemade kilns, and essentially diverted their attention from planting crops, from doing medical, the medical jobs. Everyone was focused on developing steel, which turned out to be useless, so-called pig iron, because they didn't listen to the experts on how to produce steel. Mao Zedong took the brunt of the problems, including famine, a lot of deaths, and he eventually relinquished his role as head of state. Then in 1966, the Cultural Revolution began, mainly because Mao wanted to regain some of the revolutionary spirit and purge the party and the country of reactionaries, people who weren't dedicated to his revolution. Obviously, this got out of hand. There were many denunciations and sessions in public, which my grandfather also was denounced over a couple of days. the Red Guards marched through towns, destroyed pretty much everything Western, and burned relics and books, anything attached to Western ideology and thought. And my grandfather also had all of his Western possessions burned over 2 days, including his a diploma, honorary degree from the University of Pennsylvania. So he has died in 1969 during the Cultural Revolution under house arrest. He had medical problems due to cirrhosis, many episodes of bleeding, went to the hospital for transfusions, operations, and one of the last times he went to the hospital because he was in a counter-revolutionary group that Mao had designated, was refused medical treatment, and he essentially died being untreated. Now, in a seminal event in 1972 was Nixon's travel to China to meet Mao. He did this for many geopolitical reasons, but the reasons to my mother weren't that important. You know, the trying to counterbalance Russia, not ignoring 400 million Chinese, which were the reasons Nixon went to China. But to her and many Chinese in America, this signaled the potential of going back to China to see their family. My mother hadn't seen her family since 1947, and was obviously eager to go back after being implored by her father to go back and serve the people. So the last third of the book is a story about her attempts to go back to China and how that difficulty affected her in her life within our family. Very sort of tragic from my point of view. My grandfather essentially died, as I say, in 1969, being outcast from the Chinese government. But then in 1979, after the Cultural Revolution ended in 1976, religion came back as a right. The Shanghai Religious Council, which was reestablished, honored my grandfather in a memorial, rehabilitating his name. This is at the 1979 memorial. You can see my family, top left, and his wife, Constance, my grandmother, on the right, and then local community leaders and religious leaders at the bottom. So he was, next slide, eventually buried at the Cemetery of Revolutionary Heroes outside of Shanghai. And so, his life went sort of full circle. Next slide. I just wanted to show the last photo of my mother's University of Pennsylvania medical school class at her 50th reunion. And again, I don't think you'll ever see this this type of photo again. She was the only woman who graduated from her class. Next. And my father at a church in Ningbo, his hometown. You can see the church is full. There is religious events and churches in China. This is a new church that is actually completed in his hometown of Ningbo. So Christianity and the church is not dead. It's under a different, in a different form and sanctioned by the government. But this idea that religion doesn't exist in China is not true, even though it lives under a sometimes very difficult environment. Next. And the end of the book takes place at my mother's gravesite, which my father had designed. She is the only woman, only person buried at the church. There is no cemetery, and somehow my father orchestrated her to be buried there. The church is Trinity Church, and her father's church was Trinity Church. So that was sort of an interesting link between her and her grandfather. Next. And this is the final scene of the book where I visited, took my children to visit her grave and told them the story of her life and her grandfather's life. So that sort of completes my formal talk, I ask you to tell your friends about the book. You can get autographed copies at my website, robinewanauthor.com. If you can, if you get a book, hold it up and take a photo and place it on social media. Write a review if you can, buy copies as presents, and also refer me organizations to talk to, because I love talking about this and explain the history of China and Christianity to you. And also, if you have any connections with Hollywood, spread the word there, because my ultimate goal is to make a cinematic translation of this story, which now I think would make for a better miniseries than actual movie. Next.
Robin, I want to thank you very much. This was a wonderful presentation, and I'm sure